I never imagined my life would turn out the way it did. My name is Lucas, and for the longest time, I thought I had everything in place. It was supposed to be simple, a straightforward life built on love, trust, and ambition. Amelia and I had been together for 7 years. 7 years. Yet when I look back, it feels like a lifetime, not just because of the time, but because of what was left behind. We met in college. Two souls finding one another in a sea of faces. It wasn't love at first sight, not exactly. But there was something in her. The way she carried herself, the way she smiled, even when she wasn't trying to. It drew me in, slowly but surely. She had a kind of confidence that I admired, a quiet strength. She wasn't loud or flashy, but there was an undeniable presence to her that made people gravitate toward her. Back then, I was just another guy, awkward, a little unsure of myself, trying to figure out where I belonged in the world. But Amelia, she made me feel like I could be more than I was. I thought that if I stayed close enough, I'd learn from her. I thought that was the start of something beautiful. Our early days together were simple but full of promise. We didn't rush into anything. We were careful, both of us aware of how fragile the world could feel at that age. But soon, we became inseparable, spending nights talking about our dreams, our goals, our fears. It was the kind of connection that people write stories about. I believed then, like many young people do, that we were different, that our love would withstand the test of time. I thought we had something that could endure any storm. Life after college wasn't a fairy tale, but it was a good life. We built it together. I became a financial analyst, working long hours, trying to climb the corporate ladder, but never letting go of the small joys that still mattered. Amelia had always been creative, and she found her niche as a graphic designer for a prominent firm. Her work was praised, her talent undeniable, and I admired her dedication. The praise she received wasn't something she bragged about, but I could see the way she lit up when a project went well. She was talented, driven, and yet there was always a subtle distance, a kind of detachment that I couldn't explain at first. We didn't have children. It was a choice, or at least I convinced myself it was. We had talked about it early on, but there was always a reason to delay it. Work, travel, career milestones. Eventually, I stopped asking. She was never outright against the idea, but there was a hesitation in her that made me second-guess my own desire for a family. I had no problem with it at first. After all, we were building our lives together. We had time. Our house was modest, a small, comfortable place in the suburbs. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. We had a few nice things. A sturdy car, a cozy living room with a fireplace, a garden that Amelia loved to tend to. It wasn't the kind of life that screamed wealth or luxury, but it was peaceful. I thought it was enough. And for a while, it was. The cracks started to show when the quiet moments became uncomfortable. In the beginning, it was easy to ignore, but after a few months, I began to notice the little things. She'd be distracted when I spoke to her. Not in a way that was obvious, but there was something in her eyes, a lack of focus, like she wasn't really listening to me anymore. She became more absorbed in her work, spending longer hours on projects that I knew could wait. There was always something urgent, something pressing. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, we were both busy, right? She had clients to meet, deadlines to hit. It was the reality of our lives. But then the patterns began to change. The late nights at the office turned into long weekends away for work trips. The occasional girls' night out with her friends became more frequent. I had no reason to suspect anything at first. She was always so private about those nights, saying little more than the usual, just some drinks and a little fun. I believed her. After all, it was the kind of thing friends did, right? I wasn't the kind of guy to question her every move. Trust was important to me, and I always believed she would never betray it. Still, something felt off. It wasn't just a physical absence. Though that played a part, it was the emotional distance that started to grow between us. We stopped talking as much. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and shared stories, became routine. She'd tell me about her day, but it always felt like she was holding something back, leaving parts of herself out. I noticed she started going out more, not just with friends, but by herself. It was subtle at first, a sudden urge to go shopping or grab dinner with a colleague. She wasn't a homebody, but I began to feel like there was something else out there that was taking her attention away from me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. People grow, relationships change. It wasn't uncommon for couples to have their ups and downs. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but it lingered in the back of my mind like a quiet whisper that refused to be silenced. One night, Amelia came home later than usual. It wasn't the first time, but it felt different this time. Her face seemed flushed, her eyes distant in a way I had never seen before. She barely spoke when she walked through the door, barely even acknowledged me. I watched as she hurried to the bedroom, shutting the door behind her with a speed that made my heart race. I told myself it was nothing, just tired maybe, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Something was changing, and it wasn't just her. It was me too. I could feel it, this quiet unraveling. It was subtle, but it was happening. I didn't want to face it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our life was no longer what it once was. What I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. It started as a slow drift, small moments that I told myself were nothing, just temporary shifts in the rhythm of our lives. But as time passed, I began to notice the distance between us wasn't something that could easily be explained away. It wasn't just her absence, though that had become more frequent. It was the way she looked at me sometimes, not with disdain or anger, but with a kind of emptiness that I hadn't seen before. It was as if something in her had closed off, as if I was no longer the person she saw when she looked at me. Our intimacy, once a central part of our relationship, began to wane too. I don't mean just the physical act itself, but the closeness, the sense that we were partners in every sense of the word. In the beginning, we had been inseparable, nights spent wrapped in each other's arms, mornings filled with laughter and whispered promises. But slowly, it became a routine. We still had sex, but it felt mechanical at times. There was a difference in the way she touched me, the way her eyes didn't quite meet mine. It wasn't that she didn't want to be with me. It was as if she was somewhere else entirely. I felt it in the way she pulled away in the middle of an embrace, the way her body no longer responded to mine with the same warmth. It wasn't just the nights either. There were mornings when I'd wake up and find her already out of bed, sitting by the window, staring off into space like she was lost in some thought I wasn't part of. I tried to reach out to her, tried to engage her in conversation, but more often than not, she seemed distant, wrapped up in herself. I wondered if it was work, or stress, or something deeper, but I never asked. I didn't want to intrude. Then came the nights when she would go out with her friends, or so she said. It started as occasional evenings, a quick dinner or a drink after work. I didn't mind. Everyone needed their space. But soon it became more regular. A Friday night, then a Saturday night, then sometimes even a Sunday. At first, I didn't think much of it. She deserved time to herself. But the longer she stayed out, the more it felt like she was trying to escape something. Or maybe someone. One night, after she came home late, I couldn't help myself. I asked her about it. I tried to keep my voice steady, casual even, but I could feel the tension building between us. She brushed me off as if it were no big deal, and I let it go. But deep down, a part of me knew that she wasn't just out having fun with friends. There was something more, and I began to notice it. The way she would return from these nights with a certain flush in her cheeks, a certain unease in her movements. It was as if she was carrying something she couldn't share with me. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was all in my head. But the feeling wouldn't go away. One night, as I lay in bed, waiting for her to come back, I found myself staring at the ceiling, the quiet ticking of the clock the only sound in the room. I thought about our life, about how we had built it together, brick by brick. But now it felt fragile, like it could crumble with the slightest push. I knew I had to confront her, but the thought terrified me. What if I was wrong? What if I was just being paranoid? What if the life we had wasn't unraveling at all? When she came in, her presence was more of a shadow than anything else. She didn't say anything. She just slipped into bed next to me, her back to me, her body stiff. I wanted to reach out, to hold her close, and remind her of everything we had. But something in me held back. I could feel it. The divide between us, the invisible wall that had grown higher and higher. And I knew, without a doubt, that I was no longer the person she turned to when she needed comfort. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. I watched her more closely, and it became clearer that the person I had married wasn't the same one standing in front of me. She was slipping away, little by little. I tried to ignore the signs, to tell myself it was just a phase, that maybe I had been too consumed by work or stress. But as I watched her one evening, laughing with a group of her friends at a gathering, I saw something I couldn't ignore. The way she laughed too easily, the way she looked at one of the men across the room, a stranger I didn't recognize, as if she were seeing him for the first time, and perhaps for the last time. That was when it hit me. Something had changed. It wasn't just the late nights or the emotional distance. It was her eyes. And in that moment, I realized I had become a stranger to her. The thought gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake it. What if she had found someone else? Someone who made her feel the things I used to make her feel? Someone who could give her the excitement I had stopped providing, the passion that had faded from our nights together? That was the moment I knew, deep down, that everything I had built with Amelia was beginning to crack. I wasn't ready to face it, but I couldn't deny it any longer. Something was happening, and I was powerless to stop it. The night it happened, I wasn't supposed to be there, but something inside me had been unraveling for weeks, some primal instinct that told me I needed to see for myself. She had left again, another of her girls' nights that had become routine. But this time, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the doubt had settled too deep in my bones. I followed her that night. It wasn't something I had ever done before. It felt wrong, like a violation of trust, but there was no going back now. I didn't plan to confront her, not yet. I just needed to know, needed to see if my fears were justified. I trailed her to the nightclub, a place I had never been. The neon lights outside flickered, casting an eerie glow on the street. People milled about, laughing and talking, but I was too focused on her. She had entered with a group of friends, but as I stood by the entrance, I could see her alone in the corner of the bar, talking to a man I didn't recognize. His body language was casual, but there was an intensity in the way he leaned in the way his eyes never left hers. She laughed, but it wasn't the same kind of laugh she used to share with me. It was different, lighter, freer. I stayed hidden in the shadows, trying to remain unnoticed. My heart was pounding in my chest as I watched them interact. There was an ease between them, a kind of connection that made my stomach churn. She had always been reserved with people she didn't know well, but with him, she was relaxed, as if she had known him for a long time. She wasn't the woman I thought I knew anymore. She wasn't the wife I had built a life with. Time seemed to stretch as I watched them. My hands clenched into fists, my knuckles white with tension. The air around me felt thick, heavy with the realization that something was happening, something that I was no longer a part of. I knew that this man, this stranger, had something I didn't. He was filling the gaps I had overlooked, the spaces I thought didn't matter. He was everything I wasn't, spontaneous, charming, and free. And she was drinking him in, completely captivated by him. Eventually, they left the bar together. I wanted to follow them, but I didn't have to. I knew exactly where they were going. They went to a nearby hotel, the kind of place people would go to escape, to get away from prying eyes. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, my heart breaking in a way I didn't think was possible. I had always trusted her. I had always believed in the bond we shared. And yet, here I was, watching her walk away with someone else. A stranger, a man who wasn't me. I waited until they had disappeared inside before I followed them. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Some kind of confrontation, perhaps, or maybe just a sense of closure. But I couldn't stop myself. It was like a compulsion, a need to confirm the truth. When I reached the hotel, I stood outside for what felt like an eternity, my breath coming in short bursts, my mind spinning. I could hear laughter and muffled voices coming from inside. Her laughter, the sound that used to fill our home, the sound that once made me feel like the luckiest man alive. Then, I saw them through the window. It was surreal, like I was watching a scene unfold in someone else's life, someone who wasn't me. They were sitting on the bed, close to one another, and as I watched, I saw her lean in. The man's hand rested on her leg, a gentle, yet possessive touch. And then they kissed. It was like a slap to the face, the intensity of the moment knocking the breath from my lungs. I could see her eyes close, her body relax as she gave herself to him, fully, without hesitation. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me screamed to turn and run, to escape this nightmare. But I stayed, frozen in place, watching as she crossed a line I could never have imagined. There was no mistaking it, no way to deny it. She was no longer mine. She had given herself to him. And in that moment, I realized that everything I thought I knew about us had been a lie. I wasn't the man she desired anymore. She had found someone else. The weight of the realization crushed me, suffocating me. I wanted to confront her, to storm into that room and demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. The truth was already written in the way she touched him, in the way she surrendered to him. There was no place for me in that room, no room left for me in her life. And I was too late to fix it. I turned away from the window, my hands trembling, my body aching with betrayal. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the fact that I had been blind for so long, unable or unwilling to see the truth that was right in front of me. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had loved, had chosen someone else. As I walked away from the hotel, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But nothing made sense anymore. The woman I had known, the woman who was my wife, had slipped away in ways I couldn't understand. And all I could do was walk away, leaving behind a part of myself that I wasn't sure I'd ever get back. The hours after discovering the truth felt like they existed outside of time, an endless loop of anger, disbelief, and overwhelming hurt. The image of them together, her body yielding to him so easily, refused to leave my mind. It was as though every moment of our life together had been reduced to this single, painful image. I couldn't unsee it, no matter how hard I tried. The weight of it crushed me, and with it, the realization that the woman I had trusted, the woman I had shared my life with, had betrayed me in the most intimate way. I couldn't remain passive. There was no room for indifference anymore, no space left for denial. I had seen what I needed to see, and now I had to act. I couldn't allow this man to take what was mine, to invade the life I worked so hard to build. The image of them, her with him, eating away at me, had to be confronted head-on. I didn't know exactly what I hoped to achieve by confronting them. What did I expect to happen? Answers? An apology? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that the rage building inside of me could no longer be contained. The silence of the night pressed in on me, thick with the noise of my thoughts as I forced myself to move toward the hotel where they had gone. I didn't think about what I was doing, about the consequences or the damage it would cause. I couldn't allow myself to. I arrived outside the hotel, my breath shallow, my pulse racing. I watched through the window as they sat together, too close, too comfortable. She seemed so at ease with him, her eyes soft, her body turned toward him with the same familiarity that had once been reserved for me. There was no hesitation in her touch, no awkwardness. It was as if she had been here before, as if this was where she truly belonged. The knowledge that this wasn't just a fleeting encounter, that this had been happening for some time, gnawed at me. I moved closer to the door, feeling the weight of every step. My hands trembled, the anger still bubbling under the surface, but something else lingered as well. The cold, hollow feeling of being discarded. This man had come into our life, into our home, and taken what was mine. It wasn't just her body. It was her heart, her attention. Everything I had believed was still part of our bond. When I reached the door, I didn't hesitate. I pushed it open, stepping into the room without a second thought. The man stood up slowly when he saw me, his body language unreadable. It was almost as if he had been expecting me, expecting the confrontation that had been inevitable from the moment I had discovered their secret. But it didn't matter. The moment my eyes locked on him, the rage that had been simmering for weeks exploded within me. I could feel the heat of my anger seeping into every part of my body, but I didn't lash out immediately. The sight of her, standing there frozen, her wide eyes staring at me, was enough to make the breath catch in my throat. I didn't want to see her this way, so distant, so removed from the woman I had once known. But it was too late to turn back now. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and I could never unsee what I had witnessed. I turned my focus back to him, the stranger who had so easily slipped into the space I once occupied in her life. There was no fear in his eyes, no sign of guilt. He stood tall, as if he were the one who had the right to be there. And in that moment, I understood that this wasn't just some random fling. This wasn't some mistake that could be swept under the rug. No, he had taken her, in every sense of the word. He had claimed what I thought was still mine. The distance between us was closing, but it wasn't just physical. It was a distance between what I thought was our life and what it had become, a jagged divide that no apology, no plea, could ever mend. I didn't know what I wanted in that moment. There was no clarity, no clear path. All I felt was a deep, empty ache, as though my heart had been ripped out and replaced with a hollow shell. The person I had loved, the person I had given everything to, had made a choice, one that did not include me. She remained silent, unable or unwilling to speak. The realization that she wasn't even going to try to explain, that the woman I once knew had evaporated into someone unrecognizable, hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what had happened to us, to her, to the love I had believed we shared. But standing there in that room, with the stranger watching me and her standing by, I knew one thing for certain. Everything had changed. Forever. The man finally moved, stepping back as if to give me room. But it wasn't out of respect. It was because he knew I was no threat to him. In that moment, I realized I was not in control anymore. I had no power. He had taken it from me the moment he had touched her. My body was still rigid with tension, my chest tight with the need for something, revenge, release, closure, anything to fill the void that had opened inside me. But there was nothing, no satisfaction in confrontation, no comfort in the idea that I had caught them, that I had seen the truth with my own eyes. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. As I turned to leave, the finality of it settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake off. My marriage was over. The life I had built had been shattered in an instant. There would be no going back from this moment. No way to rewind the pain, the loss, the anger. I walked away, but I knew the damage was done, and I was left to deal with the ruins of what had once been a life I thought was mine. The moment I left the hotel room, I felt like a part of me had been left behind. I walked through the corridor, each step echoing like a hollow reminder of what had been lost. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the years I had invested, the trust one had given, pressed down on me, suffocating in its finality. There was no going back. There was no undoing the damage that had been done. My marriage was a thing of the past, and I was left standing in the wreckage alone. Outside, the night air hit me like a rush of cold water, but it did nothing to numb the pain. I could feel the familiar ache in my chest, that deep, hollow feeling where once there had been love. It was gone now, replaced by something darker, something I couldn't name, but that gnawed at me with every breath. The city around me seemed oblivious to the storm raging inside. The streets were alive with their own rhythm, indifferent to my turmoil. But all I could think about was her, and the man who had taken her from me. I couldn't shake the image of them together. Even now, I could feel the weight of their intimacy, the way she had surrendered herself to him without a second thought, the way she had chosen him over me. I didn't know what was worse, the betrayal itself, or the fact that I hadn't seen it coming. I couldn't bring myself to return home. The thought of walking through that door, of facing the empty space where once we had shared everything, was too much. So I wandered aimlessly through the streets, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. What had I done wrong? What had we become? How had we ended up here, on opposite sides of a chasm too wide to bridge? It wasn't until hours later that I found myself back at the hotel, standing outside the room where everything had unraveled. The lights in the window were dim, the soft glow a reminder of the scene I had left behind. I stood there for a long time, my thoughts a blur of rage, sadness, and disbelief. I didn't know why I had come back. Maybe it was to confront her again. Maybe it was to say goodbye, to make sense of everything that had shattered between us. Or maybe it was to finally put an end to the suffocating silence that had taken over my mind since I walked out. I knocked on the door, the sound reverberating in the quiet hallway. I didn't wait for her to answer. I had no intention of giving her the chance to avoid me again. This time, there would be no running, no pretending. I needed the truth. I needed to see her one last time, to look her in the eyes and know that I wasn't imagining everything. When the door opened, she was standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or perhaps resignation. She had expected this. I could see it in her expression. She knew this moment was inevitable. But even in the face of her guilt, even as she stood there, broken and defeated, I felt nothing but emptiness. There were no words left, no explanations that could change anything. The damage had already been done. Her betrayal was laid bare, and there was no taking it back. Not now, not ever. She moved to speak, but I held up a hand, silencing her before she could say anything. I didn't need her words. I didn't need her apologies. They wouldn't change the fact that everything I had believed in was a lie. The life I had thought we shared, those years of intimacy, the trust, the love, had all been built on a foundation of deceit. I didn't need to hear her excuses. I didn't need to hear why she had done what she did. What difference would it make now? The woman I had loved, the woman who had been my everything, had chosen another man over me. And in that moment, I realized just how little I meant to her. Her eyes were searching mine, but there was nothing there for her. No forgiveness, no love, no trace of the man she had once known. I wasn't that person anymore. I couldn't be. Not after everything that had happened. She had taken too much from me, and there was nothing left to salvage. Nothing that could be repaired. She stepped closer, as if to reach out to me, but I stepped back. There was no space for reconciliation between us. There was no bridge back to what we had. I had been replaced, and as painful as it was, I had to accept it. I had to walk away. I turned to leave, the finality of it crashing down on me like a wave. It was over. There was no going back to what we once had. And as I walked away, as I stepped into the night once more, I felt the last vestige of our love slip away, leaving nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal in its wake. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.